Welcome, everybody. It looks like we're all in. Welcome to another night with Space Cowboy Books Online. I'm your host, Jean Paul, and tonight we have space opera author Jonathan Nevair sharing with us. Jonathan Nevair is a science fiction writer and, as Dr. Jonathan Wallace, an art historian and professor of art history at Moore College of Art and Design in Philadelphia, where he teaches and serves as the program head for the college's honors track. After 2 decades of academic publishing, he finally got up the nerve to write fiction, which is a good thing because from the moment he saw Star Wars Episode 4 in the theater as a child, a long time ago, Jonathan's eyes turned to the night sky and the capability of FTL drives to whisk him off to a distant star system. Finally able to put those internal visions and stories to paper, he is slated to publish all three books in his space opera series Wind Tide by the end of the year through Shadowspark Publishing. Also, his short story Further was featured in the latest episode of our Simultaneous Times podcast. So without delay, I'm going to pass it over to Jonathan for the reading portion of this event. And I've also put a link in the chat for where you can pick up the book. Book one, Goodbye to the Sun. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thanks so much, Jean-Paul. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks to Space Cowboy Books for having me. I'm really excited to be here and super happy to be supporting an independent bookshop specializing in science fiction. So I'm going to go ahead and read a passage from Goodbye to the Sun. It's an early passage, and it's going to be an interaction with the two main characters who really drive the plot, Keen Drayden and Razor. And they are on the surface of a planet named Col-2, a blue-duned planet, and that's pretty much, I think, all you'll need to know. And they're about to confront one of the main phenomena that is the opposition in the story. "There's wind," Keen said, stumbling in the growing dark. A current pushed gently against his back, billowing his sweat-soaked robe. The voice of Col-2 whispered, fluttering the white fabric in the silent desert evening. He'd noticed it at the top of the last sand ridge. It was only a wafting breeze, no more than a whisper. Between the fall and rise of the next dune, it rose to a soft but constant nudging on his backside. The air was almost polite, a welcomed interruption in the otherwise dry and hot, barren twilight. Unless he'd gotten their directional bearing mixed up, something didn't make sense. The wind tides blew towards Targite City across the open dunes, not away from it. It should be at his face. The bluff was close. Alteron, the star, fell below the horizon, and the glowing remains of a rose sunset dissolved into darkness. In all directions, the vast desert spread like a night sea. Stars dappled the crepuscular sky. Their glimmer grew denser as Keen arced his head back, away from the fading light. He recognized the Perseus constellation, observable from most solar systems in the Sagittarius zone, and the Pistol Star. It glittered to his right, low to the horizon. Its size and orange twinkle unmistakable. Keen tracked left about halfway from where the sand met sky. 700 light years away, orbiting snugly around the star Nushaba, was his destination, Haroon. Beyond the visible stellar curtain lay the great unknown. Keen's ancestors were on those vessels, drifting on a galactic current in uncharted space. A fleet of ships, its passengers in cryostasis, held the promise of answers to questions posed by curious, long-dead innovators. The exploratory armada was the second span's last principal feat before the civilization in the arm collapsed into ruin and near extinction. Now, with the third span in full bloom, a stable society had returned and demonstrated the potential of species endurance. If life, human or otherwise, existed elsewhere in the galaxy, perhaps the Armada would find it. Keen knew the odds. The chances of encountering anyone in the vast emptiness and returning eons hence to a still living world were as small as the significance of humanity to the scale of the cosmos itself. He lowered his head to the liminal landscape of rolling dunes. Razor was a shadowy silhouette standing on the last rise before the looming rock outcropping. Keen trudged up the slope. "There's wind," he repeated when he reached her. "It's the drawback. The front will be here soon. Keep moving." "Give me a minute." He bent over panting, his hands on his knees. "We stop, we die. The fissure is on the far side of the bluff. Move it." She moved on without him, Sake of the arm, he said, gasping for breath. I'm too tired. Keen dropped to the sand, legs resting on the downward side of the dune. He wiped his face with the sleeve. Ahead in the twilight, the bluff's jagged outline loomed. A second higher ledge appeared behind it, blocking out the last glow of Alteron's sunset. The rock structure was more extensive than he'd first realized. Something about that didn't make sense, unless he'd been fooled earlier in the daylight by a heat mirage. The drawback breeze faltered. Keen's robe fluttered about, intruding on the desert's silence. The hair tingled on the back of his neck. If he'd been on Haroon with its dense undergrowth, back in a soldier uniform, he would have sworn an unseen presence was about. His head swung around, seeking a source for the anxiety. In all directions lay nothing but dunes in the night. His robe slammed back, pushing hard against the front of his body. The wind reversed. Like a fast-moving object colliding with a wall, it jolted him back to attention. A distant rumbling filled his ears. Tide wave. He was up and scrambling down the dune, his mind processing the reality before him. What was he thinking? That second ledge wasn't rock. Tide waves were the signature feature of the winds on Cole 2. One led each tidal cycle, drawing coalgite dust from the drawback up into the air, forming a swell that rose high up into the atmosphere until the gathered particles of sand pulled it down through gravity, and it broke, crashing in a gale of unimaginable strength. The wave's force had never been measured. No equipment could withstand its titanic might. Targite was located just beyond the breakpoint, with an added measure of distance for insurance. The city was safe from its devastating impact, but close enough to the danger zone to harvest the most powerful gusts of each wind tide that followed in its wake. Keen might not have cared about living all that much, but his instincts defied him before the sublime terror. He made flight in haste and was down the last dune and crossing the open ground to the bluff. Razor's faint silhouette rounded the bend on the rock's far side. The gusts blowing towards him intensified and grew hot. He remembered why his brain made him run. A front wave wasn't just wind. It was heat, far beyond what a human body could withstand. No one knew which way you died when consumed in the turbulent swell. Either way, he wasn't interested in finding out. The approaching storm roared. A shrill whining grew to a near deafening pitch. His eye dusters shielded his eyes against the blowing sand, but if he didn't move fast, he would lose his bearing in the growing darkness. The bluff's corner was ahead. He ran faster than he realized, the looming terror rising inside his chest. His mind flashed back to Haroon, a memory of fleeing an ambush that killed most of his platoon. The mental recall sent a high-voltage charge through his unfit, underworked limbs. Survival mode kicked in, pushing his body to its limit. Would it be enough? It wasn't on Haroon. Even with that surge of combat adrenaline on the tropical planet, he hadn't escaped his attackers. That was where it all went wrong in his life. Not this time. He was either going to make it, or this was going to be the end. He rounded the corner and a wall of wind slammed him into the side of the rock face. His head and elbow crashed against jagged stone. Clinking metal echoed through the swirling gale. He was down on the ground, disoriented from the blow to the head. Razor's voice was calling, but he couldn't comprehend what she was saying. Move it, Drayden, or die, your choice. His hand went to the medallion around his neck. It touched only skin. Razor's screams whirled around him like a conjured spirit. Where was the pendant? Without it, nothing was left. There was no reason to live. Sand pelted the rock face and spat back, barraging him into blindness. He groped his hands in wide arcs, the eye dusters useless in the intensity of the sandstorm. A hand grabbed his robe, pulling him. No! He screamed over the howling gale, resisting. His palm made a wide arc across the ground. It crossed nothing but rock and sand. A second hand wrapped around his neck, long fingers holding him tight. Keen's mind knew those hands, red dune marks on onyx knuckles. Razor dragged him away. He fought her, seeking blindly across the ground. Her strength overpowered him, and he slid away amidst the violence of the surging winds. A gush pushed open a seam in the ceiling above them. The river of sand spread apart. Razor's red hair appeared against the bluff wall. Behind her, her fiery spikes was nothing but darkness. The sky and stars shut out by a blanket of blue dust and wind. The backdraft was almost too strong to resist as the swell curled into a barrel overhead. Get up, she screamed. Keen slid across the ground, kicking his heels to dig in and get to his feet. He slipped and braced himself with a palm. It hit metal, the medallion. His hand closed on it. It's over us, Razor yelled. Keen was up and groping in sand-swirling darkness, his injured arm dragging its fingers across the rock face as they hurried forward. Inside, she screamed as the horror revealed its full terror. Orange and red static electricity sparked against the cliffs as the heat arrived, the flashes illuminating a narrow entrance and the doom enveloping them overhead. Razor shoved him into a pitch void. He tumbled over hard rock and down an abyss, and couldn't have been happier about it. He rolled into sand at the bottom of a cavern. Razor crashed into his backside with a thud. He recovered and threw off the eye dusters. The hand that clasped the medallion was empty. Where is it? His hand went to his side, searching. His eyes adjusted in the dark. The walls of the cave shuddered and small rocks and dust fell from above. Cover your head, Razor yelled over the roar above them. The cavern grumbled, resisting the fury passing overhead. Keen's eyes caught a glint of gold in the dark. He lunged and snatched the chain as a rock fell, narrowly avoiding smashing the medallion. He wrapped his hands around his head, kneeling into a ball in his portly frame. How long until it passes? As if in answer, the cavern settled. A steady howl, like a battalion of ghosts, sang above them. The regimental chorus echoed down the narrow passageway they'd fallen through. The wave passed. Now followed the tide. Keen lowered his arms from his head and collapsed onto his back. His labored breathing bounced off the walls, competing with the tides howling outside the protection of the small cavern. He leaned his head to the side and glanced over at Razor. She sat, panting in near darkness, arms hugging her knees. Are we safe? She didn't respond. Her rapid exhalations echoed off the cavern walls. Are you hurt? The moat rose, ignoring him. Her shadowy form unslung a gear bag from her back and reached inside. She rotated to face him, her eyes like twin stars glimmering in an otherwise pitch night sky. Still, she didn't respond. He didn't know what else to say or do. Luckily, the darkness of the cave hid the shame of his face. He felt like a useless burden. Razor withdrew a thick metallic ring and waved it through the air. It flickered into life, illuminating the interior. A bare cavern some 50 feet wide in a rough circle surrounded them. On the far wall, the same dune marks on Razor's knuckles glowed on the rock face. The precision of the carved letters was pronounced against the otherwise jagged and unpredictable stone surface. A dark recess adjacent to the dune marks led to another passage running down deeper into the bluff's internal structure. Razor's face was covered in sweaty blue dust. In the luminous light cast by the glow ring, perspiration dripped down in slow and haunting lamentations, streaking her head and neck. What is that? She nodded at his hand. Her words bounced off the rock ceiling, echoing against the tide's ghoulish howl. Nothing. She walked to him, her blue eyes wide and intense. You lie. He glared up at her. It's none of your business. It's my business when you choose a piece of jewelry over your life, when my life is also on the line. He fumbled into a seated position, struggling with his injured arm. With a trembling hand, he shoved the pendant into his robe pocket. It's an ambassadorial medallion. Without it, I'm no one. Guard it well. You're only here because you're someone. You're an ambassador with strings to pull. We have a deal. Yeah, I know. Keen collapsed on the ground, closed his eyes, listening to the tide raging above them. The bluff's hallowed interior embraced them like a sheltering womb. All the terror of the outside world was so close, yet kept at bay by a giant petrified body, a natural rock formation whose belly rested under the sands. Keen raised his good arm, hand extended. Give me some water. You've had your share and more already. He opened his eyes and watched Razor walk away. A light ring grasped in her hand. She used it to guide her way to the opposite side where the darkened opening led further down into the subterranean shelter. At least he would get to sleep tonight. The sandy floor was as welcoming as the bed that had most likely been laid for him in Targite. Don't get comfortable, she said from the far side of the cavern. We're not staying.
Thank you, Jonathan, for sharing that excerpt from Goodbye to the Sun. We're going to move on to the interview portion of the event, and if anyone from our audience has questions, feel free to drop those in the chat, and we'll make sure to get to them. So, Jonathan, in Goodbye to the Sun, you used the interesting narrative style of, from chapter to chapter, switching back and forth between third person and first person. Can you tell us a little bit about what made you decide to use this technique and why?
Yeah, sure. It's funny too, because it was hard for me to choose a passage to read because of that toggling. And I had to choose between that third person or that first person, which I really liked working with in the book. And I think that the original motivation was a desire to really amp up subjectivity of experience, that I really am interested in the way in which reality exists in different degrees, depending on who's experiencing a particular setting. And so what I wanted to do was I wanted to have two main characters, and I wanted to really emphasize the idea that they could both be experiencing the same events together. But while that was happening, they were both having very different realities and coming to very different decisions under the same circumstances. And in doing that, I was drawn to this idea of, well, maybe I'll switch point of views. And what that did was that added another element, which I really liked to it, which was it gave me this kind of internal external tension as well. The first person works really well for me because it gets into the interior of characters, I find. And I really like the way in which there's an intimacy and a real personal communication of a character's feelings through that first person voice. And then I wanted to counter that with the third person experience of a plot and a story running with Keen's perspective. And so we get, in a way, the events and actions of Razor through Keen's perspective. And then we get a kind of a reflective moment continuously from Razor of Keen's actions and their effects on her, as well as her own decisions in moving forward in her journey. And so it became an interesting kind of a toggling effect. And I ended up choosing to put Razor in the future, which added another element of that tension. So Razor's speaking from 50 years or so in the future, recalling the events, and then you're experiencing them live time as they unfold for Keen. And it really worked quite well in the end. Yeah.
It was fun to be able to zoom in, zoom out from chapter to chapter in that way, and it was quite effective. So we have a
Yeah.
question.
Oh, go ahead.
We have a question from Sharon in the audience, and this ties in with the next question that I'm going to ask. So I'm going to give them to you together. Sharon says, one of my favorite things about your writing is the wonderful use of color. The landscape is colorful. The characters have colorful complexions and hair. Can you talk a bit about how you decided to include those elements in your world building? And I would like to add to that, as a space opera author, of course, world building is a huge part of writing in this genre. So when you go about writing space opera and world building, do you world build first, or do you develop your characters first? And how do you go about each of those?
Oof, okay, that's a lot of questions. All right, so I'm going to hold off on the Sharon color question until I answer the character and world building one, and then I'll get to it. I definitely start from characters. I'm a character-driven writer, and I'm very much drawn to character-driven space operas. And so I start from characters. And but I don't plan a character. I don't, sit down and say, I need a character like this and write down traits and build them and then throw them into a world or a story. I just start writing. And I let that character that I start writing come to life on the page. And that's how Razor started. And Razor was the beginning of this book. Razor began as just kind of me opening up. I had actually just read the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin, and was sort of blown away by not only the intimacy and the kind of eulogistic way of writing in there and the lamentation of the tone, which I thought was amazing. But the second person voice was so interesting, and it was such a powerful character that it drove me to try to build from a character point of view first. So I definitely start from characters. And Razor was where the book started. And then I would say, building the world comes to life as I start to see myself through the eyes of the character. I was just writing last night, and I was writing an action scene for a new book, and I realized that I really do kind of vicariously put myself in the experience of the character, and as a person who writes in third limited, I really am almost like right behind the head of the person and able to sort of convey to the reader what's going on in the greater version of the story, but it's always confined to that viewpoint. And so I kind of literally sort of see the world through that particular person. And I think that that's where, for me, the world building part really comes in that the world kind of just manifests itself through the imagination around me. And one of the things I love about science fiction, and I think it's why I write science fiction, although fantasy does this too, is there's so much freedom to imagine alternative realities or enhanced realities. And that's really where the color, to answer Sharon's your question, where the color comes in. You know, why not push the boundaries of the spectrum in terms of topography, right? And you know, the color of sand or of someone's hair. And so I think, you know, the idea of trees behaving and looking a certain way, which comes up a lot in the series as it moves forward, is part of that imagination. And same thing with politics too. I think a lot of the identity politics that are in the book are also about kind of looking, you know, at an expanded and, you know, broader and maybe more sort of even liberated version of the world, which science fiction lets you do. In terms of what colors, you know, yeah, I'm an art historian. So, you know, I do choose colors, I think, with a bit of a kind of a nod to their relationships with one another, thinking about complementary colors and the way that, you know, colors pop and relate to one another. So, you know, eye color and hair color, you know, the color of sand and the color of sky, those are very important to me. Definitely. I'm really into color. You know, right now, cyberpunk's my big thing. Like I watched Blade Runner 2049 for the first time not too long ago, and I didn't really even care what the story was at a certain point. I was literally just like, visually, it was just delicious. And I was just eating and consuming the colors. And so I'm definitely very, very visual.
It's interesting that that color would come into characterization and world building at all, but of course it's such an important part. And that also ties into the next question I had for you, which is, when world building, how, as your profession as an art historian, affected the way that you build worlds and the way that you look at histories within those worlds?
Yeah. Okay, if there's a difficult spot for me in writing science, space opera in particular, which is so big, right? It's how do you, especially when you do a character-driven space opera, I think, how do you construct an immensely large empire and universe, and yet not let exposition and lengthy passages of explaining the way the world works and its history overtake, right, the story and the pacing? And I definitely struggle with that. I think that's probably, for me as a writer, one of the biggest things I struggle with. And you know, full disclosure, Sharon is one of my beta readers and is amazing. And, you know, it's beta readers and critique partners who I think are really helpful at that moment. Because, you know, they can kind of give you a sense of, you know, I'm not quite fully understanding the politics of what you're referring to here. Could you give me a little more? Or, you know, you're losing me here. You know, this is really interesting, but it's not relevant to the story. And I think that to come, Jean-Paul, I'm going to come around to the art history part of it. But I think one of the things, you know, you do as a writer, and I'm sure the writers in the audience know this, is you write all around your story. Right? And you write this epic amount of information all around your story, but it doesn't necessarily get into the book, but it needs to be written so that you understand the world and the politics and the social, you know, the social dynamics that are at work there. And then you can just sort of draw on it as you need along the way. As an art historian, yeah, I think that from an organizational standpoint, I think, you know, just working on projects where you have to accumulate information and put it together and narrate it in a certain fashion to make a point, especially evidence-based methods, right, in art history. Like, you know, I need to build a case almost, and at the end have this conclusion that's very strong and that's convincing. I think that really helps when you transfer over to fiction writing, this idea of moving a plot forward and building as you go, and building that history as you go, so it accumulates, so that by the time the story ends, the narrative, it resolves itself in a way that's satisfying, but the world is fully formed in the mind of the reader. You know, and I'm amazed. I'll just say I'm amazed, you know, at some of the other writers out there, at their ability to bring in details and not lose the reader in the pacing of the story. People like recent authors like Essa Hansen and T.A. Bruno in The Orbit of Sirens. They have this incredible ability to include so much just delicious detail in these, you know, technological and other aspects of a world, but yet the story keeps moving. And I really like that. I tend to be a little bit more lean, I think, on the leaner side. You know, and it's always a delicate balance. So I don't know if that answered your question, but you know, I think that's how world building for me works. Sort of a quick spurt and an idea that leads to the beginning of a story, and then I step back and I stop. And I spend a little bit of time building the world, and then I go forward with the rest of the story.
So you sort of answered this next question already,
Sorry.
but however, it's also partly a compliment here. There's a lot of off-the-page history in the book. I feel like through the characters' dialogue and responses to things that I really knew about the couple hundred years before, almost as if there was an implied prequel. How did you go about implying such dense backstory and history?
With difficulty. You know, the thing is, when, you know, like publishing, right? Full disclosure for publishing, when you're a debut author and you're writing your first novel, you have to ride this line between a standalone, you know, it's often like it's a standalone with series potential. And so you have to kind of have a situation where, you know, the story can stand on its own, but there's more to tell. And I guess for me, the way that worked was kind of like you said, almost like putting the car in reverse. I went backwards. And I think creating a series of earlier epics and periods in history helped me to be able to write a more narrow story at the present. I almost felt like it gave me the ability to create an empire and the space and scale that I wanted, while remaining a kind of a close, focused, character-driven story. Like, it is an empire in a world, right? I mean, it's a big world, and there's a lot off the page. And I think that the way that I was able to do that was, rather than say, this is really big and all this stuff is going on all around the story right now, instead what I did was, this is all the stuff that's happened. And you can see how the world has grown over it's called spans in the Wind Tide universe, 3 spans. And, you know, from the first span to the third span, this is how we got here. Here's the problems, here's what's happened along the way, and now here we are. And so I think it kind of, it funneled out in a way that ballooned and worked without overtaking the story. I don't know.
I thought it worked quite well. So no, it did not
Okay.
overtake, but it made me feel like I understood the behavior of the characters more on account of those implications. And speaking of the characters, it's an interesting choice to have 2 main characters. And what were your motivations in creating such polar opposite main characters, such as Keen and Razor? And who are we going to meet? What can we expect without too many spoilers for book 2?
Yeah. It's weird. Every book of the 3 Wind Tides that will be out all have 2 main protagonists. I don't know why. It seems to be my thing. I'm gonna try to maybe not do it after that, but it seems to work for me. In terms of these 2, tension and conflict. You know, it's like everyone always says, like, you got to have tension and conflict, right, to write a good story. Well, what did I took 2 people and I put them at the farthest polarities and extremities, morally, ethically, and even in a socio-political way. And, because of that, it created a lot of tension. And I think it made it easy for me to have a lot of conflict running through the story. What was really interesting to me was the more that I wrote the book, the more I realized that while they're very far apart, they're also the same. And I came to understand that in a way they both want the same thing. They just have different motivations and a different set of maybe a different moral philosophy about how they're going to get it and what they should get and what they deserve. And I think that that's really what the story became about, was kind of figuring out how the two of them were going to maybe have to work together to resolve their differences. And the degree to which they do it, I won't spoil it, is complicated. But I think having those two characters really made it a lot of tension, but in the end revealed that they did want the same thing. They were just coming from different places and had different things to learn. And I really like that. And to answer your question, I continue that in the next book, Jotty's Wager, which is the second Wind Tide book. And Jotty, who is one of the supporting characters in the first book, will become one of the two main protagonists with a teenage character named Isla. And they have their own, in a way, differences and tensions that are a little bit different. It's a mentorship kind of a relationship, but there's a lot of struggle between them that also works to a resolution by the end of the story. Clearly, I have some maybe issues with resolving conflict, right, in my past or something that I'm working through in my stories, but between two characters. But yeah, I think I find it's really fun to be able to have two people, arguing with one another. I like writing that dialogue. I like that banter a lot.
I don't think those dualities are uncommon, but perhaps as a literary device in this way, it is, but an effective one. Um, so switching gears a little bit, can you tell us about in the introduction or the forward to the book? There's a mention and to Antigone, the Sophocles play. Can you tell us about what this connection is and how you decided to use it as an inspiration?
Yeah. So when I first started thinking about writing this space opera, I had written a book. I had written my first try at fiction, and it was awful. It was near future, post-apocalyptic, every single trope that you could ever imagine, right? Like I used it, cliche to the max. And I realized in writing that it was kind of me getting my literary sea legs. Like by the time I finished it, I was like, okay, now I think I understand how to write a book and I need to start completely over. But I did get some really good feedback on that first book, which was, your world building is really nice. Your prose is very nice, but I didn't emotionally connect with your characters. I didn't feel a lot of attachment or investment in them. And I took that to heart, and I did some reading. I looked up about writing more emotionally driven characters, working on that kind of a thing. And I began to look at plot structure when I thought about what I was going to write. And I came across the tragic model, particularly I looked at Greek tragedy. And I thought, okay, well, you want emotions? Okay, here's like, extreme. This is going to work well. And the more I began to look at the model of a Greek tragedy, the more I really liked the plot points and the way that it differed a little bit from, something like the hero's journey or another kind of a standard way you might go about working with beats and plot points. In particular, I really liked, there were a couple of moments in there. There's hamartia and peripetia, these two terms that are these moments in the tragic story. One is the fatal flaw, where you make a decision that the main character thinks is the right one, and they're so happy about it, but it's going to be the thing that makes everything fall apart. And then there's the peripetia, this moment like where they realize what they've wrought, like they have this moment of, oh my gosh, what have I done? And then it's this dash to kind of, resolve something even at at their own expense. I really liked that. I thought, ooh, this is wonderfully powerful. And so I started to look through Greek tragedies, and I found Antigone by Sophocles, and I started reading it. And I actually saw a modern adaptation too, a performance, a London-based performance of it, with, and I can't remember the actor's name. She's Doctor Who, and it was fantastic. And there was a lot of this, just a lot of interesting aspects to Antigone that I liked. It had a lot of main characters. Excuse me, a lot of female main characters. It was a story that really brought themes out that I was very invested in. The power and the extent of government, the tension between responsibility to family and state. This was also at a time where in America, our administration was very complicated between family and state. So I think that was also sort of rattling in my mind. And so Antigone kind of became this interesting study. And the more that I looked at it, and then once I read it, I just sort of had all these ideas sort of coming out at me. But I will say that Goodbye to the Sun is not a retelling of Antigone. You can't really, point to characters and say, this is Creon and this is Antigone and this is Ismena. You wouldn't work that way. I've kind of pulled from moments of each of them and done a mashup basically, and put it all back together. But the themes are really there. And the themes, I think, really helped me to bring out a kind of a tension in the story that I wanted to deal with, which has a lot to do with morality and ethics, especially this kind of battle between, personal, independent free will and responsibility to the family and the state. And so that really kind of drove me towards Antigone. And I will say that there's a way in which some of the characters in Antigone, like Antigone and Ismene, who are sisters, they're very inflexible on their viewpoints and they argue a lot. They both kind of want the same thing, and they're both flawed. And I saw a lot of Keen and Razor in their relationship, having a parallel there. I did actually reread Antigone today. It's very short. You can read it very quickly. And do I have like 30 seconds, Jean-Paul? So I just thought I would let you know that you might notice that there's a very strong, distinct difference in literary tone between the Razor chapters and the Keen chapters. And the Razor chapters have a very sort of a very kind of like literary prose quality, as well as a kind of a lamentation to them. And that was really inspired by the passages of Antigone and also the chorus. That relationship actually of the chapters of Razor was kind of almost a structural decision based off of a kind of a chorus coming into the play continuously. But I was just going to read about 10 lines from short lines here of Antigone speaking, because I think you'll be able to hear the tone that is in Razor's voice as well. Unwept, friendless, with no marriage hymn, unfortunate, I am taken down the prepared road. It is no longer right for unhappy me to see this unholy eye. But no friend groans over my unwept fate. O tomb, O underground home everlasting, whither I journey to my own people, whose great number so many destroyed, Persephone has received among the dead. To these I go down, the last of them all, and worse by far, before my allowance of life is spent. And then the chorus responds, the same violent winds still rage in her soul. I am going alive into depths of the dead. Which of the gods' laws have I transgressed? Why should I still look to the gods in my unhappiness? That kind of like, question and heaviness, I think really got to me. And I was just like eating it up. And I wanted to write like that. And I think Antigone gave me that as well. I talked a lot, but you can tell I'm really excited about Antigone. And I continue with that in the next two books as well. So the myths of the Trojan War, from the Aeneid and a little bit from the Odyssey, are infused, particularly in the Sack of Troy and the Trojan horse is infused into the space opera Heist in the second book. And in the third book, the Eumenides, is a play which focuses a lot on justice, and that's used in a similar manner as well.
So you mentioned the importance of family there, and that was one of the things in your world building for Goodbye to the Sun that I thought was very interesting, is the filial structures and the way gender is defined is considerably different from what we see today, both family and gender. Can you expand on those constructs, both as a world building technique, but also perhaps more in a personal regard?
Yeah. I think, to go back to that thing we talked about with science fiction giving you the ability to imagine a different world or a better world, I think that my desire to use a certain approach towards gender and family was driven by that same impulse. That, I wanted to do something maybe a little bit unusual in that I wanted to create a world where gender and gender politics were no longer a political issue. Um, and that didn't mean that there aren't problems and conflicts in this world. There are still huge problems in the Wind Tide universe. But as I began to go along, I began to decide that, gender and gender expression wasn't going to be an issue. And I wanted to figure out a way to give people agency to communicate their gender preferences. Because one of the things I deal with a lot in my own work is, where I work is really being sensitive to and trying to respect the diversity of gender and self-expression. And I thought, well, maybe there might be a way to use linguistics and language to create a circumstance where someone presents themselves using language that has a connotation of a particular gender preference. And so I invented this system where a suffix is used. And so the first time you introduce yourself to someone who you don't know, you add a suffix onto your name. You can also use a hand sign if you would rather not verbally communicate that, or if it's less efficient to speak in a situation. And at other times, maybe in a service industry or something like that, you might even have an icon on you that indicates to someone how you'd like to be addressed and how you're expressing yourself. And I found the more I began to work with that, the more interesting it became. And the more I wrote, the less important it was to the world, and the more it was just an element of the way the world was. And I really liked that. And I wanted that. And I worked a lot with a sensitivity reader named Arena, who's amazing, and really helped me to refine that. But it has a range of expressions. So there is various ways in which people can choose to perform and express gender, whether it's they can choose different suffixes and different combinations. There's non-binary, there's bigender, gender fluid, there's feminine, masculine. There's various ways and various combinations based off of those suffixes. In the second book, I expand with nonverbal communication a lot with sign language in that way as well. In terms of family, I found as I started to build this world, a kind of a world where gender had become quite normative in a diverse way, I realized that I was referring to people as a brother or a father. And it dawned on me that that wasn't appropriate because it was bringing back, either it could be considered, let's say, a patriarchal or matriarchal, it didn't even matter. I was bringing back a kind of a traditional binary structure to the language around family. And so what I did was I chose to create a alternative vocabulary. So parent replaces father and mother, and there's no distinction. Sibling and child. And that's maybe the one that is most difficult because the connotations around it sometimes are hard to grasp as a non-Wind Tide universe person. So like, Aridus, who is the parent of Keen Drayden, is quite old, and he refers to Keen as a child. And, we have the connotations of like, oh, he's implying he's immature maybe, right? Or, not acting like an quote adult. But in fact, it literally for them just means you are the offspring of an individual or two individuals. Yeah. And so I was really excited about that. I really liked having the opportunity to have the ability to envision something different. Yeah.
I particularly enjoyed the use of sign language. It reminded me of the battle speak in Dune, but as done in a way of respect instead of this secretiveness.
Yeah. The sign language is interesting, and it comes out a little more in book 2 as well, which is fun.
So speaking of book 2, what are you currently working on? What's coming up next for you? I know Jati's Wager, book 2 in the Wind Tide series, is up for pre-order right now. Can you give us a little hint about book 3? And yeah, what
Sure.
have you got going on?
Sure. So Jati's Wager book 2 just went on pre-order. That's a space opera heist, and it's the second book. It's a very different tone from the first book. It's much more of a kind of a action-based, think sort of like Becky Chambers' Long Way to a Small Angry Planet meets Ocean's 11 kind of a thing. It's got a real heist team there. And the third book, which I'm finishing up now, is No Song But Silence, and that is the last of the 3 books, and will resolve this version, at least, of the Wind Tide universe cycle. I don't want to give too much away on that one, but it also has its own tone. It's interesting. Each of the books sort of has its own tone. I'm surprised. They've all kind of taken on a character unto themselves. But you will see that in each book, characters carry over. So Jati ends up in book 2. Other characters from book 2 will end up in book 3. After that, I'm planning on writing a standalone. As I was saying earlier, I'm smitten with cyberpunk, and I think I'm going to write a shorter, very fast-paced cyberpunk, maybe a little biopunk kind of thrown in there, standalone novel. And then after that, I'd like to go back to maybe a larger series. But I want to take a break and do a little autonomous, independent book after this to catch my breath and really keep it nice and focused and fast paced after the big Wind Tide world.
Excellent. Well, I'm looking forward to that. And as a fan of cyberpunk too, you're going to have to get in touch when it comes out, because
Okay.
love to have you do a reading with that. So thank you to our audience. Thank you to Jonathan Nevair. You can get a link in the chat there for Goodbye to the Sun. Book 1 in the Wind Tide series comes highly recommended. And if you're interested in joining us for our next event, oh yeah, check out Simultaneous Times episode. The last episode, it features a piece of flash fiction from Jonathan. Got him to scale back from the large-scale space opera for a second. And join us on August 10th for our next Flash Science Fiction installment of the series. We're going to have Christopher Rocchio, Brent A. Harris, and David Brin. So we've got quite a lineup of excellent authors there. Thank you so much, Jonathan, and thank you to our audience for participating and being here.
Thank you, John.